Hey, welcome back to Edgar Cayce Narratives. If you've been here before, it's good to see you again. And if this is your first time here, this channel is where we explore real patterns in human experience that don't always have simple explanations, but feel deeply familiar when you hear them. Different people, same ending. You meet someone new, and it feels like a fresh start. The connection builds naturally. The trust grows step by step. And you start to believe this time will be different from everything that came before, but over time, small things begin to repeat. The same kind of distance appears. The same doubts show up. And eventually, the same kind of betrayal happens again, even though the person is different. At first, it feels like bad luck, like you just keep choosing the wrong people. But when it happens more than once, and then again after that, it stops feeling random and starts to feel like something deeper is repeating in the background. So the question slowly changes from, why did they do this, to something harder to ignore, which is, why does this keep happening to me? It started in a way that felt normal, nothing unusual, nothing that would suggest how it would end. Just two people meeting at the right time and slowly getting to know each other through simple conversations and shared moments that felt easy to trust. The connection didn't feel forced, and that was what made it convincing, because it felt natural enough to believe it could grow into something stable and real. In the beginning, there were small signs that could have been noticed, but they didn't feel important at the time, because everything else seemed to be working. There were moments when communication felt slightly unclear, or when something didn't fully match between words and actions. But those moments were easy to explain away, especially when the emotional connection was strong enough to make those details feel minor. As the relationship moved forward, the closeness deepened in a predictable way. Trust became more personal, and the sense of safety started to build. Not as a sudden shift, but as something gradual that felt earned over time. The more time passed, the more it felt like this connection was different from anything before. And that belief made it easier to ignore anything that didn't fully make sense. Then the change came. Not suddenly, but in small shifts that were hard to define at first, like a slight distance in tone, or a delay in responses that didn't used to be there, or a feeling that something was no longer as open as it once was. These changes didn't seem serious on their own, but together they created a quiet tension that was difficult to explain, but impossible to ignore. Eventually, the truth revealed itself in a clear but familiar way, not through a dramatic moment, but through something undeniable, a breach of trust that couldn't be explained away anymore. It could have been dishonesty, or emotional withdrawal, or a hidden connection with someone else. But whatever form it took, the result was the same. The trust that had been built slowly was broken in a way that could not be repaired. After that first experience, there was a period of reflection and a quiet promise that next time would be different, that the same situation would not happen again, because now there was more awareness, more caution, and a stronger sense of what to look out for. It felt like a lesson had been learned, and that was enough to believe the pattern had been understood. But then, sometime later, another relationship began, and again it started in a way that felt different. With a new person, a new context, and a new sense of possibility that made it feel separate from the past. The early stage followed the same emotional rhythm, trust building step by step, closeness growing through shared experiences, and the belief returning that this time things were truly different. And yet, as time passed, the same small signals began to appear again, subtle at first, almost easy to miss, but strangely familiar in a way that was difficult to explain. The same kind of communication gaps showed up, the same moments of uncertainty appeared, and the same instinct to overlook those details returned, because the connection still felt strong enough to justify it. Once again, the relationship moved toward the same outcome, not because the situation was identical, but because the emotional path felt almost the same, leading step by step toward another moment where trust was broken in a way that felt both painful and strangely recognizable. It wasn't just the betrayal itself that stood out, but the feeling that this had already happened before, even though the person was different. By the third time, something started to shift internally, because the pattern was no longer easy to ignore or explain away as coincidence. The faces were different, the details were different, but the emotional structure remained the same, and that was what made it harder to dismiss. The same progression kept repeating, from trust to closeness to distance to betrayal, as if the sequence itself was fixed. At this point, the emotional impact was no longer just about one relationship ending, but about the accumulation of similar endings, each one reinforcing the same experience in a slightly different form. It became less about what each individual person had done, and more about why the same kind of outcome kept appearing again and again. By the fourth experience, the question was no longer focused on the other person at all, because that explanation no longer felt complete or satisfying. Instead, a different kind of awareness started to form, not fully clear yet, but strong enough to create discomfort, a sense that something deeper was repeating beneath the surface of each situation. And that was the moment where the experience stopped feeling like a series of separate events and started to feel like a single pattern unfolding over time, one that hadn't been fully seen yet, but could no longer be ignored. At first, the realization does not come as a clear conclusion, but as a quiet discomfort that keeps returning, especially in moments when something feels familiar in a way that is hard to explain. It is not a dramatic insight, but a growing sense that the situation is unfolding along a path that has already been experienced before. Even if the details look different on the surface, the person begins to look back, not just at the most recent relationship, but at all of them together. And for the first time, they are not comparing people, they are comparing patterns. When seen this way, certain similarities become difficult to ignore, not because they are obvious at first, but because they repeat in structure, in timing, and in emotional response. There is a noticeable similarity in the type of partner they feel drawn to, not in appearance or background, but in behavior and emotional availability, in the way the connection begins quickly and feels intense early on, and in the way subtle inconsistencies appear but are often overlooked. It is not that these people are the same, but that they create the same kind of emotional dynamic. At the same time, the person starts to notice their own role in the process, not as blame, but as participation, because certain choices repeat as well, such as trusting quickly when the connection feels strong, ignoring early signs that something is slightly off, and choosing to stay even when uncertainty begins to grow. These actions do not feel like mistakes in the moment, but in hindsight, they follow a consistent pattern. What becomes clearer is not just what happens, but when it happens, because the breakdown tends to occur at a similar stage in each relationship, after a certain level of closeness is reached, and after a certain level of emotional investment has been made. It is almost as if the pattern requires a specific condition before it repeats, and once that condition is met, the outcome becomes more likely. This is the point where the shift begins, because the focus slowly moves away from individual situations and toward the structure that connects them. The question is no longer centered on the actions of the other person, but on the repeated sequence itself, and how consistently it unfolds regardless of who is involved. The realization is not comfortable because it introduces a new kind of responsibility, not in the sense of fault, but in the sense of involvement. Because if the same pattern keeps appearing, then something within the person may be connected to how that pattern forms. This does not mean they caused what happened, but it suggests they are part of how it continues. A key thought begins to take shape. not as a final answer, but as a clear shift in perspective, which is that this is not just something that happens to them, but something they are inside of, something they move through again and again without fully seeing its structure. And once that idea appears, it becomes difficult to return to the earlier explanation of simple bad luck or coincidence, because the repetition is too consistent and the similarities are too specific to ignore. This is the moment where awareness replaces confusion, where the experience stops being a series of disconnected events and becomes a recognizable pattern, and where a more difficult question begins to form, not about what happened, but about why it keeps happening in such a similar way. It's not just happening to me. I'm part of how it happens. At this stage, the pattern is clear enough to recognize, but not clear enough to explain, because even though the repetition is visible, the reason behind it still feels out of reach. The person understands that something is repeating, but the deeper structure of why it repeats in this specific way is still unresolved, and that creates a space where a different perspective becomes possible. This is where the idea of Edgar Cayce's readings enters, not as an answer that replaces everything else, but as a different way of looking at the same pattern. Cayce did not describe human experience as limited to a single lifetime, but as something that continues across multiple lifetimes, where emotional dynamics, relationships, and unresolved experiences can carry forward in different forms. Within that perspective, certain patterns are not random, and they are not isolated to one period of life, but instead reflect a continuity of experience that may not be fully visible from a single point in time. This does not require belief to consider, but it offers a lens that shifts the question from "why is this happening now?" to "where might this pattern have started, and how has it continued?" In many of Cayce's readings, there is a recurring idea that roles within relationships do not always remain fixed, and that over time, people may experience both sides of the same dynamic. Someone who once held power in a situation may later experience what it feels like to be on the other side of that same pattern, not as a reversal meant to punish, but as a way of experiencing the full emotional reality of that dynamic. Applied to the pattern of betrayal, this introduces a different possibility, which is that the current experience may not only be about what is happening in the present, but also about a continuation of a dynamic that has existed before. In this view, a person who repeatedly experiences betrayal may, at another point in a different context, have been part of that same dynamic from the opposite role. The important detail here is how this idea is understood, because it is easy to interpret repetition as punishment or as a system of reward and consequence, but that is not how Cayce described it. Instead, the emphasis is on balance of perspective, where experiencing both sides of a situation creates a more complete understanding of that dynamic, not through theory, but through lived experience. This reframing removes the idea that something is being done to the person as a form of judgment, and instead suggests that the pattern may be continuing because it has not yet been fully understood from all sides. The repetition is not there to harm, but it also does not stop on its own, because the underlying structure remains active until something within it changes. From this angle, betrayal is not only an external event caused by another person, but part of a larger emotional pattern that includes both roles, the one who experiences the betrayal and the one who creates it. The focus shifts from identifying a single cause to recognizing a dynamic that can move between positions over time. This does not mean that every experience of betrayal must come from a past life role, and it does not remove responsibility from people in the present. But it introduces the idea that some patterns feel deeper and more persistent because they are connected to something that did not begin in the current moment. The intensity of the experience and the way it repeats with similar structure becomes part of what makes that possibility worth considering. At the same time, This perspective does not replace psychological explanations, but exists alongside them, because the pattern can be seen both as a continuation across lifetimes and as something reinforced through behavior, choices, and emotional responses in the present. The two views do not cancel each other out, but instead describe the same pattern from different angles. What changes here is not the external situation, but the way the pattern is understood, because instead of asking who is responsible for each individual event, the attention moves toward the dynamic itself, how it forms, how it repeats, and how it might continue unless something within that structure shifts. And once that idea takes hold, the pattern no longer feels like a series of unrelated betrayals, but like a single thread that runs through different experiences, connecting them in a way that is not immediately visible, but becomes clearer when viewed as part of a larger continuity. This does not solve the pattern, and it does not make the experience easier, but it changes the question in a fundamental way. From "why does this keep happening to me?" to something more complex and more difficult to answer, which is, what part of this pattern have I not fully seen yet? And what role might I be repeating without realizing it? Once the pattern is seen through a wider lens, it no longer feels like a single personal story, but something that appears in many different forms across different people, even when the details are not exactly the same. The structure repeats in ways that are easy to overlook at first, but become clearer when multiple cases are placed side by side and compared based on how the experience unfolds rather than who is involved. In many Cayce-style cases, the same kind of emotional dynamic appears again and again, where trust is built in a way that feels strong and real, followed by a gradual shift that introduces uncertainty, and eventually leads to some form of betrayal or emotional break that feels both painful and familiar. The people involved are different, the context is different, but the sequence remains consistent enough to suggest that the pattern itself is the central element, not the individual situation. There are cases where someone repeatedly finds themselves in relationships where they give more than they receive, where loyalty is not matched, and where trust is broken in subtle ways that build over time rather than appearing all at once. There are also cases where the pattern shows up in a different form, where the betrayal is not direct, but comes through emotional distance, avoidance, or a lack of honesty that slowly erodes the connection. What connects these variations is not the specific action, but the emotional structure underneath, because in each case there is an imbalance that develops over time, and a point where that imbalance becomes visible through some form of betrayal or disconnection. The pattern is flexible in how it appears, but consistent in how it functions. When this is viewed alongside the idea of role reversal across lifetimes, the pattern begins to look less like a single-direction experience and more like a dynamic that can move between positions, where the same emotional structure is experienced from different sides over time. This does not mean that every case follows that exact path, but it provides a framework that helps explain why some patterns feel deeper and more persistent than others. At the same time, this pattern can also be understood through modern psychology, where similar dynamics are described in terms of attachment styles, emotional conditioning, and subconscious attraction. People are often drawn to relationships that feel familiar on an emotional level, even if that familiarity includes discomfort or instability, because the mind tends to repeat what it recognizes, not necessarily what is healthy. In this view, a person who has experienced betrayal may unconsciously move toward situations that recreate similar emotional conditions, not because they want the same outcome, but because the underlying pattern feels known and predictable in a way that is difficult to resist. The repetition is not intentional, but it is consistent, because the same internal responses lead to similar external choices. This creates a loop where past experiences shape expectations. Expectations influence perception, and perception guides decisions, which then lead back into situations that reinforce the original pattern. Over time, this loop becomes stronger, not because it is correct, but because it is repeated often enough to feel natural. When both perspectives are placed together, the Cayce view of continuity across lifetimes and the psychological view of pattern reinforcement in the present, they begin to describe the same phenomenon from different directions. One focuses on where the pattern may originate beyond a single lifetime, while the other focuses on how it is maintained and repeated through behavior and perception in the current one. The important point is not which explanation is correct, but that the pattern exists in a way that can be observed, recognized, and studied through experience. Whether it is seen as something carried forward or something built over time, the repetition follows a structure that does not change easily on its own. This is why the pattern does not stop simply because it is painful, because pain alone does not break repetition, and awareness alone does not automatically change behavior. The pattern continues as long as the underlying dynamic remains active, and that dynamic can exist at multiple levels: emotional, behavioral, and possibly even beyond what can be directly observed. Across different cases, the same realization begins to appear, which is that the external situation may change, but the internal structure often remains the same. And as long as that structure is unchanged, the pattern has a way of recreating itself in new forms that lead to similar outcomes. This is what makes the experience feel so persistent, because even when a person tries to make different choices, the deeper pattern can still guide those choices in subtle ways, shaping what feels right, what feels familiar, and what is allowed to continue despite early signs that something is not fully aligned. And when this is fully recognized, the focus shifts again, not just from people to patterns, but from patterns to structure, because the real question is no longer about why the same outcome keeps happening, but about what within the person and within the pattern itself has remained consistent enough to produce that outcome again and again across different situations. At that point, the pattern is no longer something that can be explained by chance or by the behavior of others alone, but something that has its own continuity, its own internal logic, and its own way of repeating until it is understood at a level that goes deeper than surface awareness. When the pattern has been seen clearly enough, the focus naturally shifts from what is happening to what it means, not in an abstract or philosophical way, but in a direct and practical sense that relates to how the experience continues. The repetition is no longer the main question, because that has already been established, and instead the attention moves toward what allows the repetition to remain active over time. One of the most consistent insights that emerges from both the Cayce perspective and psychological observation is that patterns tend to continue until they are fully understood, not just recognized on the surface, but understood at the level where they no longer operate in the same way. This does not happen quickly, and it does not happen simply because the pattern has been noticed once or twice. There is an important difference between awareness and resolution, because awareness is the moment where the pattern becomes visible, while resolution is the point where the pattern no longer repeats in the same form. Many people reach awareness and expect change to follow immediately, but in most cases, the pattern continues, sometimes in a slightly altered way, but still following the same underlying structure. This is where the experience can become confusing again, because even after recognizing the pattern, the person may still find themselves in situations that feel familiar, and may still respond in ways that align with the old dynamic. This does not mean the awareness was incorrect, but it shows that awareness alone is not enough to interrupt the pattern. What becomes clearer over time is that the pattern is not only external, but also internal, meaning that it is connected to how the person interprets situations, how they respond emotionally, and how they make decisions within relationships. These internal elements do not change automatically when the pattern is recognized. And because they remain active, they continue to shape outcomes in subtle but consistent ways. In the context of betrayal, this might include how quickly trust is given, how early signals are interpreted or dismissed, and how long a situation is allowed to continue after uncertainty appears. These are not mistakes in a simple sense, but repeated responses that are part of the larger structure of the pattern. From the Cayce perspective, this can also be seen as a continuation of an unresolved dynamic, where experiencing both sides of a situation is not enough on its own, because the deeper understanding comes from how the experience is processed and integrated, not just from going through it. If the internal response remains the same, the pattern has not fully shifted, even if the external role appears different. This leads to a more grounded and direct insight, which is that patterns do not stop just because they are painful, and they do not stop just because they are seen, but they begin to change when the internal structure that supports them starts to shift in a consistent way. That shift is not based on a single realization, but on a gradual change in how situations are recognized, interpreted, and responded to over time. It also becomes clear that the pattern is not something separate from the person, but something they are involved in, not as a cause of what others do, but as part of how the dynamic continues to unfold. This distinction matters because it avoids blame while still allowing for responsibility in how the pattern is engaged with moving forward. At this point, the meaning of the pattern is no longer hidden, because it points directly to what has remained consistent across different experiences, not in other people, but in the structure of the interaction itself. That structure includes both external events and internal responses, and as long as both remain aligned in the same way, the outcome tends to repeat. So the real shift does not come from trying to avoid betrayal or control external outcomes, but from understanding what within the pattern has not changed yet, and how that unchanged part continues to shape what happens next, even when the situation looks different on the surface. And this is where the pattern begins to move from something that happens repeatedly to something that can eventually change, not because it is forced to stop, but because the conditions that allow it to repeat are no longer the same as they were before. By this point, the pattern no longer looks like a series of separate experiences, but like one continuous structure that has been repeating through different people, different situations, and different moments in time, while still leading to the same emotional outcome. What once felt random now feels connected, and what once felt confusing now feels recognizable, even if it is not fully resolved yet. When you look back at the beginning, at those first moments where everything felt new and different, it becomes easier to see how the same path was already forming, not in an obvious way, but through small decisions, familiar feelings, and subtle signals that were easy to overlook. The pattern did not suddenly appear at the end. It was present from the start, just not fully visible. And when you bring that awareness into the present, the question is no longer about predicting what will happen next, but about noticing what feels familiar as it begins, because that is where the pattern starts to take shape again. It is not always clear, and it is not always easy to change, but it becomes possible to see it earlier than before. If the same experience keeps returning, what part of it hasn't changed yet? That question does not ask for a quick answer, and it does not lead to a simple conclusion, because the pattern is not something that exists only outside of you, but something you move through and interact with in ways that are not always obvious at first. And once you begin to ask that question honestly, without trying to force a conclusion, it changes how you see the pattern itself, not as something fixed, but as something that continues only as long as the same conditions remain in place, both around you and within you. If something in this story felt familiar to you, not just in one moment, but as a pattern you've seen in your own life, take a moment and think about where it shows up, and what part of it still doesn't fully make sense yet. Because sometimes the most important detail is the one that keeps repeating quietly in the background. I'm curious how this connects to your experience. So if you've noticed a pattern like this in your relationships or in any part of your life, share it in the comments. Or tell me what part of this topic you want me to explore next, so we can go deeper into it in future videos. And if you want more videos like this, where we break down real human patterns through clear storytelling, make sure to like the video and subscribe to Edgar Cayce Narratives so you don't miss what's coming next. Noi Dung.